Um, Thank you very much. I don't have pictures. Um, I have four immigrant grandparents who came, all Eastern European Jews who came from different parts of what is now three different countries, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, then it was all Austria-Hungary. And I just got back from a vacation in that part of the world. And I went to Auschwitz, which is the first time I've been. And I said, thank God they all got out. It was very moving. Okay, let me see if I can work this. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very glad to be here. A couple of words about the Pew Research Center. We are a someone make this bigger. We call ourselves a fact tank. We provide information that we hope is policy relevant and is data driven. We, not me, do public opinion polling, secondary data analysis. We don't take policy positions. If I happen to say take a policy position, please ignore it, because I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm not supposed to talk about it, but every now and then something slips out. And we're a subsidiary of the Pew Trust, and we get most of our money from there, which is a very nice thing. Okay, little. I've got a couple of other things. I've got probably much more than I can talk about here. I'm going to kind of skip through some of it. I will be sending a PowerPoint next week that the organizers will do what they want with it. I'll be glad to send it to anybody who asks. So I'm going to talk some about the demography of children, a little bit of a primer on numbers and trends, racial composition and a focus on age distribution, immigrant families and their children. In the context of overall trends, there's a couple of very interesting things about immigrant families that are I think not well known, and it affects the way we look at it. Then a little bit on poverty rates and a little bit on health insurance from our own data. I think these are two important factors that affect the health and well-being of children. We have more children now than we've ever had in the country. This is data from 2015. There's about 73 million children. When I talk about children, I'm talking about people under 18. We just passed the baby boom peak recently, about 15 years ago, because in 1970 there were 70 million children. But children make up about a little less than a quarter of the U.S. population, and that's the smallest share that we've ever had. And both of these trends are going to be continuing. We're going to have more children as we go forward, and the share is going to be smaller of the overall population. The elderly population, again, I define by 65 plus, which I'm not sure I consider so elderly anymore. But the numbers have been growing, and sometime around 2040, there are going to be more seniors than children. And this is a trend that will accelerate over the next 15 years or so. This looks at, the bottom line is the percent of the population that's foreign born. About a little less than 1 in 7 Americans now is an immigrant. That's close to the peak that we had around the turn of the 20th century. And the second line here looks at what share of children have immigrant parents. That includes children who are themselves immigrants, which is the smallest share of that. But Most of it is people born in the United States to immigrant parents. We're up over a quarter now of the population is what I call second generation, first and second generations. And that number, the percent foreign born is likely to go up. The share that are U.S. born, the share that are first and second generation is going to stay around what it is now. It may go up a little bit as we go forward. Hang on a sec. The share of children who are racial ethnic minorities has gone up a lot. I'm talking about African American, Latino, Asian, American Indian, and mixed race children. They represent now about just under half of all the children, 48%. The big increases over the last 50 years have been due to the significant rise in Latino children and a rise in Asian children, but they're still only 6% of the children. We've done projections looking at what this looks like going forward. There's a caveat here. We don't know what race people are going to call themselves. We don't know what races people are going to be using in the United States or how it's going to be defined. This sort of projection assumes that we're using today's definition. And I can guarantee you we're not going to be using today's definitions in 50 years. So take that with a grain of salt. But over the next 50 years or so, the Latino share is going to stay about the same of children. We expect continued immigration, but somewhat lower fertility. Based on current trends, we expect the share of children who are of Asian background to go up considerably, and the minority, and I put that in quotes, the minority will be a majority of children very shortly, actually, but it's going to go up to almost 60% going forward. And this is no surprise. The dark bar at the bottom is the share of children of each group who are foreign born. It's highest among Asians, and the lighter bar above it is the share who are U.S. born with immigrant parents. And for every group, the U.S. born with immigrant parents is considerably larger than the immigrant. The only way you can be an immigrant child is your parents bring you. What happens is the immigrants come, they have families. The families are mostly children born in the United States. The United States is, in the United States, those children are citizens by birth, which I think has gone a long way to integrating immigrants, and I think the United States has done a very good job. It's not without problems, but a very good job compared to other countries in terms of integrating the immigrants who come. And part of the reason, in my opinion, is that the children born here are automatically citizens. So here you can see the Latino and Asian groups. The children are dominated by first and second generation. The African American black population is now up to about 17%. First and second generation, and that's been growing a lot in recent years. This looks at the distribution across. This bar is the total population across race groups. So 62% of the U.S. population is white, non-Hispanic, which I've for shorthand called Anglo. 18% Hispanic, 12% black, 6% Asian. That's the total population. The child population's a bit different. 52% Anglo, which is consistent with the previous charts. Larger share Hispanic, larger share black, actually a slightly smaller share Asian due to the low fertility of Asians. Now, children of immigrants are very different. The children of immigrants are only 14% white, and that's because of the very large share that are Latino and Asian. In contrast with this, and this is a theme of the next couple of charts, the senior population is 78% Anglo. And there have been people writing about gray-brown conflicts, generational conflicts. The senior population tends to vote a lot more than children, who basically don't vote, that we know of. And they tend to vote more than the immigrants. The naturalized citizens can vote, but there are a lot of immigrants who are not citizens. So this population is largely white. This is a set of age groups. Let's see. The first three are the child age groups. The next three are the so-called working age, and then the seniors are over here. This is 1990. This is 25 years ago. You can see this trend where younger ages are less white than the older ages due to Latinos here on the bottom and the aggregate of non-whites. So in 25 years ago, almost 90% of the elderly population was white. This has changed a bit, but you can see the under 6 pop is basically 50-50 at this point. And as we go across the age spectrum, this is the number that was there before, but each older age group is whiter than the one younger. If we go forward 25 years, you can see that the population racially is going to look very different. With still the elderly population of 2040 is going to be predominantly white, but the younger age groups are closer to 50-50 as we go forward. Okay, this is, we estimate, and I'll show the number, we estimate there are about 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the country. But if we look at their families, and here I'm talking about nuclear families, parents, spouses, and children, extended families would increase this a bit, but I'm looking basically at the nuclear families here. The nuclear families, the adult unauthorized immigrants are slightly more male than female, but 46% are adult women. There's about 750,000 unauthorized immigrants who are under 18. But if we look at their families, there's an additional 6 million people, including about 5 million US-born children whose parents are unauthorized immigrants. There's been some research that shows there's an impact of parents' legal status that goes beyond their, in this group, they're somewhat lower levels of education, they're lower incomes, but there's an independent effect of the parents being unauthorized. There's an additional 1 million people, which some of these adults are actually US-born children of the unauthorized immigrants who are over 18. Some are spouses, but we're not just talking about 11 million people, we're talking about 17 million in their immediate families. If we look at children of immigrants, which is who we're talking about here today, they fall into, there are about 19 million children of immigrants. A little over a third have parents who are legal immigrants but not US citizens. A lot of these are eligible to become US citizens but haven't done so. There's another third whose parents are U.S. citizens because they've naturalized. And there's a little bit under a third, or 5.6 million, whose parents are unauthorized immigrants. And these are the numbers. This is from a year earlier than the numbers I just showed, but about 5 million who are U.S. born. These are our estimates, just to put some context on this. The number of unauthorized immigrants peaked around, first of all, it went up very rapidly from 1990, growing by about 500,000 a year, peaked about 12 million, dropped between 2009, 7 and 9, and since then has stayed roughly constant. You'd never know this if you listened to the campaign last year. You'd think we were being flooded, but it is what it is. This is the U.S. born children. These numbers are all a little different, but the unauthorized immigrant children has actually dropped. It peaked in the mid-2000s at about 1.5 million. That's because to be an unauthorized immigrant child, you have to have come here as a child or been brought by your parents. If you turn 18, I move you out of the child population. So because we haven't been getting very many new unauthorized immigrants, the number of children has been dropping. Thank you. But the number of U.S. born children of immigrants has been going up, and it's around 5 million. It doesn't go up faster because this is a population that's now been here a long time, and the U.S. born children are aging into adulthood. I don't have the chart for this, but the median Mexican unauthorized immigrant arrived in the United States in the 20th century, not the 21st century. It means over half of the unauthorized Mexican adults came before 2000 and have been here more than 15 years. So this is no longer a new population. It's a settled population. And unauthorized immigrants are much more likely to be your idealized couple with children. This looks at households. 44% of unauthorized immigrant households have a couple with children under 18. For legal immigrants, it's a third. For U.S. native households, it's only 18%. Now, some of that's because the U.S. native households are older, and some of them used to have children, but no longer do. But still, about half of this difference between these two is due to the greater likelihood of the unauthorized immigrants living as couples and with children. And this is true of legal immigrants as well as unauthorized immigrants. The immigrant families with children are a bit more likely than other families to have two parents. So again, these are the sort of ideal American family of two parents with children. In the case of immigrants, it's about 80% of the families with children have two parents there. In the case of U.S. native families, it's about 2/3. So the immigrants are more likely to be in two-parent, the immigrant children are more likely to be in two-parent families. Little about poverty. These are not our data. These are the official data from the Census Bureau. But poverty rates, this is children, this is working age adults. They move together, of course, and during recessions, the numbers tend to go up, and during recoveries, the numbers tend to go down. We haven't made huge amounts of progress in reducing poverty. The rates are still around 20% for children and 12% for this. What we have done is reduce poverty among the elderly. This is the 60s. This is Medicare and Social Security kicking in, and you'll notice that these numbers don't go up and down nearly as much. they tend to go down, even during recessions. So the elderly are much better off than children in terms of poverty, and much better off than the working age population. These are poverty rates of adults. Unauthorized immigrants have the highest, which is not particularly surprising. They tend to have lower incomes. So about 20% of unauthorized immigrants live in families with incomes below the poverty line. That's about twice what it is for native adults, and a bit higher than lawful immigrants. It's the children where there are big differences. The lighter bars here are US-born children. The darker bars are immigrant children. And for lawful immigrants, the immigrant children have higher poverty rates. For unauthorized immigrants, they both tend to be very, very high. Over a third of immigrant children of unauthorized immigrants are living in poverty. The reason, I think, for the somewhat lower rates of the US-born children is those families have been here longer, so they have slightly higher incomes. This is another policy-relevant point. Here we're looking at poor children, children whose families live in poverty with incomes below the poverty line. 3/4 of unauthorized immigrant and legal immigrant children live in two-parent families. A lot of them, the mother is not working, but in any case, the families don't have income, and they don't have income supports because they're not eligible. For U.S. native families, less than half of the children live in two-parent families. So the picture of the immigrant families vis-a-vis poverty is a little bit different than, they are not single-parent families that are suffering, that are in poverty because there's only one parent to work. They are largely in two-parent families. Health insurance. These are data from the American Community Survey. It's not a great vehicle for collecting data on health insurance, but it's what we have, and it seems to match fairly well some of the other data sources. Adults. 9% of natives are without health insurance, and I have some trend data that I hadn't looked at in detail before, but it's fascinating, I think. That's coming later. Lawful immigrants, it's about 13%. Unauthorized immigrants, it's over half. The unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for the various new mechanisms of getting insurance through Obamacare and various ways. They are to the extent they have insurance, they're largely getting it from employers, and a lot of them don't work for employers that provide health insurance, or they can't afford to pay for the health insurance their employers provide. In the case of children, it's basically the same picture. The US-born kids, only 4% are without health insurance. They do better than their parents. They're eligible. A lot of them are, the reason is they're eligible for some forms of health insurance that their parents are not. Among lawful immigrants, it's a bit higher, but again, among unauthorized immigrant children who are unauthorized, first of all, there's a lot more children here. This is 9% of 5 million. This is 50% of 750,000. So both of these are large numbers of children without health insurance, but in terms of a rate, again, half of the unauthorized immigrant children are not eligible, don't have health insurance. The big difference here is what I'm sure all of you know a lot more than I do, the CHIP programs. The non-citizen children are largely not eligible for that, so that's why the differences show up here. This is 95, 2000, 2010, 2015. there's some more years. I have more years in here, but it sort of obscures the trends. And you can see that this is adults, that there's been a big drop, which may or may not go away as we go forward, but there's been a sizable drop in the rate of uninsurance for U.S. natives, 15% to 9%. And there wasn't much change before that. Large drop among lawful immigrants. This is a lot of percentage points, but it's still very high among unauthorized immigrants. I suspect some of this is people who are married to U.S. natives who may qualify. But now, if we look at children, this is native parents, native children. This is lawful immigrants with U.S.-born children. This is lawful immigrant parents with immigrant children. And there have been huge drops here. And the drop starts earlier. It starts after 2000. And my recollection is that's when S-chip started. So you can see it works. People are getting health insurance. Doesn't work so much for unauthorized immigrant children. The U.S.-born children of unauthorized immigrant parents are eligible for I have about 2 more slides, so I'm going to make it. The U.S.-born children had very high rates of uninsurance back here in the 90s, but these children are eligible for CHIP, and it seems to be working. It seems to have worked. It's down to 9%. And again, this is the large group. This is the group that's 5 million kids. So driving this down has had a significant impact. This is the smaller group, and the rates are still very high. These children are not eligible for the CHIP program. So it's a case where policy seems to work, at least to some degree. This is what share of the uninsured the unauthorized make up. This is the unauthorized adults and the children of unauthorized immigrants. It went, as the unauthorized immigrant population went up a lot, this went up from about 10% here to about 14%. So about 1 out of 6 of the uninsured are unauthorized in unauthorized immigrant families. That hasn't changed very much as the numbers of unauthorized immigrants have not grown. I thought this would actually go up a little, but it really hasn't. But it's still about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7. So the health insurance is an interesting case. It's a case where policy seems to work, and but there's still work to be done. Thank you. There's a lot. I got a lot more stuff, and I'll be glad to answer questions. You can look on our website, pewresearch.org, under the Hispanic, for more about the demography of unauthorized immigrants. And I will be glad to send this and other material to anybody who would like to have a copy. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Dr. Mendoza, I have a question.
Sure.
So, California.
Could you use the microphone, please?
Sorry. California health insures undocumented children. Are there any other states, and have you studied the effect of having insurance for all children?
I have to plead ignorance, almost complete ignorance on that. I know there are a few other states that do, but I don't know them. And we have not looked at, the Pew Research Center doesn't do policy outcome research either, so we haven't looked at that. But there are people who are doing that.
I'm curious I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the distribution of race and ethnicity in the older senior population and how much of that disparity in distribution is related to life expectancy. I noticed that there were, for example, less seniors that were African American or Black or Hispanic or Latino, and wondering how much life expectancy plays into that number.
It has an impact. It has a bigger impact on the African American population than on the Latino and Asian populations. There's a puzzle about Latino life expectancy, that the numbers you get when you crank this through are higher than people expect. But the big impact is the lower share of African Americans. But the main reason that the numbers aren't higher is fertility 65 years ago and who was here, and the immigrant population. As we go forward, we're going to see the white numbers, the white share go down because of the historic experience of immigration. But probably, my guess is that a couple of percentage points of the representation of blacks is due to the higher mortality there specifically. It also has an impact within the elderly population because the life expectancy at age 65 is quite different. There are some strong education differences, and mortality for people with lower educations is quite a bit higher at the older ages. So that can have an impact on how long people live, how long they're able to get Social Security, and their life prospects after 65 as well.
One more question?
I wonder if you have any information about the unaccompanied minors and what's been happening to them.
It's with the data sources we have, it's very hard because it takes a couple of years before they start to show up in our data, and once they get into the population, they're no longer they're in families, so it's very hard to identify them. The numbers have been growing, but there's still a pretty small share of the unauthorized immigrant population. We're talking a couple of 100,000 people. It's not a small number of people, but it's out of 11 million people. So they're part of this picture, but this picture is from a couple of years ago. And I expect as we go forward, we'll see more of them showing up as unauthorized immigrant children. But it's a little hard to detect in some of the data sources we have. I will be around today, so if you have questions, feel free to stop and ask me, and I may or may not know the answer, but I'll be glad to tell you, and thank you very much for having me.
Just one brief comment on the demography issue. As you see that the percent of kids is going down, the percent of adults, older adults, is going up, that means at some point those are going to cross. And all those kids that are going to be, quote, minority have to support older folks that are white. So that will be an interesting political question for the future.